Rouletteburg was no ordinary town. It was a place where fortunes were made and broken within a single evening, a playground for the desperate, the hopeful, and the insatiably greedy. The streets thrummed with life, as if the very air pulsed with the whispers of chance. Glittering chandeliers illuminated the grand casino at its heart, where the clatter of chips and the spinning of the roulette wheel created a hypnotic melody, a siren call to all who dared to dream of instant wealth. Into this whirlpool of ambition and ruin arrived Alexei Ivanovich, a young man employed as a tutor in the service of a Russian general. The general, an aging aristocrat who had spent his life chasing status and wealth, was now ensnared in a web of debts that threatened to destroy him. Yet he remained as pompous and self-assured as ever, parading his fading grandeur before anyone. Who would pay attention? Alexei's position in the household was tenuous. Though employed to teach the general's children, his duties were vague, his authority minimal. He was more an observer than a participant in the drama unfolding around him, a role that suited his temperament. Alexei was sharp-eyed and quick-witted, with a sardonic sense of humor that often masked his deep insecurities. He had come to Rouletteburg not just to fulfill his duties, but to seek something more, though what that was, he could not yet articulate. The general's household was a study in contradictions. On the surface, it exuded wealth and refinement, yet beneath the polished veneer lay chaos. Chief among its inhabitants was Polina Alexandrovna, the general's stepdaughter. Polina was a woman of rare beauty, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the soul. She carried herself with an air of quiet defiance, as if daring the world to challenge her. Alexei was utterly captivated by her, though he sensed that she regarded him with a mix of amusement and disdain. Polina's presence in the household was both a blessing and a curse. She was the general's pride and joy, yet her independence and sharp tongue often clashed with his overbearing nature. Alexei found himself drawn to her despite, or perhaps because of, her aloofness. She seemed to hold some secret within her, a mystery that Alexei longed to unravel. The general's fortunes hinged on a single thread, the health of his wealthy aunt, Antonida Vassilievna, known to the family as Grandmama. The old woman, a formidable figure in her own right, was rumored to be on her deathbed. Her passing would secure the general's inheritance and allow him to pay off his debts, which had been growing steadily under the influence of his latest obsession. Madame Blanche Blanche was a Frenchwoman of dubious reputation, a woman whose charm and beauty masked a calculating mind. She had ensnared the general with her coquettish smiles and promises of affection, all the while bleeding him dry. Everyone in the household knew her true nature, yet no one dared to speak of it. The general, blinded by infatuation, clung to the hope that Blanche would become his wife, once his financial troubles were resolved. Amid this turmoil, Alexei found himself increasingly drawn to the casino. The grand building stood like a temple to fortune, its gilded doors beckoning all who sought to change their destiny. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The roulette wheel spun endlessly, a blur of red and black that held the promise of salvation or ruin. Alexei watched as men and women placed their bets with trembling hands, their eyes alight with hope or darkened by despair. At first, Alexei resisted the lure of the wheel. He told himself he was above such base temptations, that he was merely an observer. But the longer he lingered in the casino, the more he felt its pull. There was something intoxicating about the atmosphere, something that stirred a primal hunger within him. He began to imagine himself at the table, his fortunes rising and falling with the spin of the wheel. Polina, too, seemed to sense the change in him. She watched him with a knowing smile, as if daring him to succumb. Their interactions grew more charged, their conversations laced with unspoken tension. One evening, as they walked together through the town, Polina turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Tell me, Alexei," she said, her voice low and measured. "Do you believe in luck?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I believe in chance," he said finally, "but luck is something else entirely." Polina smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps luck is simply the courage to take a risk." Her words lingered in Alexei's mind as he returned to the casino that night. He stood at the edge of the roulette table, his heart pounding in his chest. The wheel spun, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The first time Alexei Ivanovitch placed a bet, it was almost an accident. He had no grand intentions, no elaborate strategy, only the impulse of the moment. A single coin lay in his palm, cool and heavy, as he hovered near the roulette table. Around him the crowd hummed with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the spinning wheel. It was Polina's words that pushed him forward. Luck is the courage to take a risk. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. The croupier's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Place your bets, messieurs et mesdames." Alexei reached out and placed the coin on red. The wheel spun, the ball clattered, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. Alexei's breath caught in his throat. Then, with a faint click, the ball settled into its slot. "Red wins," the croupier announced. The thrill of victory coursed through Alexei's veins, sharper and more exhilarating than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't the money. His winnings were modest, hardly enough to change his circumstances. It was the feeling of control, the illusion that he had bent the world to his will, however briefly. From that moment, Alexei was hooked. The roulette table became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. Alexei began to frequent the casino, sometimes under the guise of idle curiosity, other times with Polina watching from a distance. Each spin of the wheel was a gamble, a dance between fate and free will. He played cautiously at first, placing small bets and withdrawing when he won. But as his confidence grew, so did his risks. He told himself he was in control, that he was too clever to fall into the traps that claimed so many others. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. The wheel was not just a game, it was a reflection of his soul, chaotic and unpredictable. Polina, meanwhile, continued to dominate his thoughts. Her presence in the general's household was a constant reminder of his own insignificance, yet she had a way of making him feel seen, as if she understood him better than he understood himself. Their conversations were charged with tension, filled with unspoken questions and hidden meanings. One evening, Polina handed Alexei a sealed envelope. Her expression was unreadable as she pressed it into his hands. "Take this to Mr. Astley," she said. "Mr. Astley?" Alexei repeated, confused. "Yes, you know him, the Englishman who's always hovering on the edges of our lives. Deliver this to him and do not open it." Alexei hesitated. The task seemed simple enough, yet there was something about Polina's tone that unsettled him. He nodded, tucking the envelope into his pocket. The tension in the general's household was palpable. Every telegram that arrived carried the weight of anticipation and dread. Grandmama, the general's wealthy aunt, seemed to linger in an indeterminate state, alive enough to forestall her inheritance, but frail enough to keep hope alive. For the general, every day without news was a day closer to ruin. His obsession with Blanche had driven him to the brink of financial collapse, and yet he clung to the illusion that her affections were genuine. Alexei Ivanovitch, meanwhile, found himself drifting further into the orbit of Polina Alexandrovna. She had become the center of his thoughts, her every word and gesture a source of fascination and frustration. She was to him both a puzzle and a challenge, a woman who defied his expectations and unsettled his soul. Polina's enigmatic behavior took a sharp turn one afternoon when she appeared at Alexei's door, her expression cold and determined. In her hands she held a small parcel, wrapped in fine paper. "Take this," she said, thrusting it toward him. "What is it?" Alexei asked, hesitating. "Jewelry," Polina replied. It belonged to my mother. I want you to take it to the pawn shop and sell it. I need the money." Alexei stared at her, his mind racing. The request was as shocking as it was puzzling. Why would Polina, who carried herself with such pride, resort to such an act of desperation? "Why me?" he asked finally. "Because I trust you," she said, her voice firm, "and because I have no one else." The pawn shop was a small, dimly lit establishment tucked away in a narrow alley. The proprietor, a wiry man with sharp features and a calculating gaze, examined the jewelry with a practiced eye. "It's worth more than this," Alexei protested, as the man named his price. "Perhaps," the pawnbroker said with a shrug, "but this is what I'm offering." Reluctantly, Alexei accepted the money, feeling a pang of guilt as he pocketed the meager sum. When he returned to Polina and handed her the money, she took it without a word. "What are you going to do with it?" Alexei asked, his curiosity outweighing his discomfort. Polina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "That's none of your concern," she said. Her curt response stung, but Alexei knew better than to press her further. That evening, Alexei returned to the casino, the weight of the day's events heavy on his mind. The roulette table beckoned. To him, like an old friend, its spinning wheel a balm for his restless thoughts. He placed his bets with a sense of detachment, watching the wheel spin with the practiced calm of a seasoned gambler. The ball landed on red, then black, then red. Again. Each win brought a fleeting rush of satisfaction, while each loss gnawed at the edges of his composure. As the hours passed, Alexei found himself drawn deeper into the game. He began to bet larger sums, chasing the high of his earlier victories. The crowd around the table blurred into a sea of faces, their voices merging into a cacophony of excitement and despair. It was only when he reached into his pocket and found it empty that he realized how much he had lost. The cold night air hit them as Alexei and Polina stepped out of the general's house. The streets of Roulettenberg were quiet, the faint glow of the casino still visible in the distance. Alexei tightened his grip on Polina's hand, the weight of their shared decisions pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Where do we go now?" Polina asked, her voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. Alexei paused, scanning the dimly lit road ahead. "Away from here, somewhere we can breathe, think clearly. We'll find a place where none of this matters anymore." Polina gave a faint, almost bitter laugh. "Do you really think such a place exists, Alexei?" "I have to," he replied firmly, "for both our sakes." They walked in silence for a time, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Alexei's thoughts raced, his mind replaying the events of the past days. Every victory at the roulette table, every glance from Polina, every encounter with Blanche and the general felt like pieces of a puzzle he was still trying to assemble. As they turned a corner, Polina suddenly stopped, pulling her hand free. Alexei turned to face her, his expression questioning. "What's wrong?" he asked. Polina hesitated, her face shadowed in the dim light. "Alexei, I need to know, why are you doing this? Why risk everything for me?" The question caught him off guard. He searched her face for an answer, but the truth was already clear in his heart. "Because I love you, Polina, and because I believe you deserve more than this life you've been. Trapped in?" Polina looked away, her expression conflicted. "You don't even know the worst of it," she murmured. Before Alexei could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. He turned sharply, his body tensing. A figure emerged from the shadows, the faint glint of a weapon catching the moonlight. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice low and menacing. "Running off in the dead of night, are we?" Polina's face paled. "It's one of Blanche's men," she whispered. Alexei stepped in front of her, his jaw tightening. "What do you want?" The man smirked, his gaze flicking to the bulge. In Alexei's coat pocket, where the money was hidden. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said. "Hand it over, and we won't have any trouble." Alexei's heart pounded as he considered his options. The money was their ticket to freedom. but the man's calm confidence suggested he wasn't alone. If Alexei resisted, things could turn violent. Polina placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but insistent. "Don't, Alexei," she said quietly. "It's not worth it." Alexei hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect Polina and the need to keep their hard-earned escape within reach. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a portion of the money. "Take this and leave us alone," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The man accepted the money with a satisfied grin, tucking it into his coat. "Smart choice," he said, "but don't think this means you're free to go. Blanche has her eyes everywhere." With that, he disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Alexei and Polina alone once more. Polina let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. "We'll never escape her," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, we will," Alexei said firmly. "But we have to be smart about it. No more impulsive moves. We'll find a way to get out of Roulettenberg without anyone knowing." Polina nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "Do you really think we can outrun all of this, Alexei?" "We have to try," he replied. "We've come too far to give up now." Mr. Astley was an enigma. Unlike the other denizens of Roulettenberg, who flaunted their wealth and ambition, he was quiet and reserved, a man of few words but deep observations. Alexei found him at the edge of the casino, watching the roulette. Tables with an inscrutable expression. "I have something for you," Alexei said, handing over the envelope. Mr. Astley took it without a word, his eyes lingering on Alexei for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded as if to himself and walked away. The encounter left Alexei with more questions than answers. What was Polina's connection to Mr. Astley, and why did she trust him to deliver the message? As Alexei returned to the casino, his thoughts swirled with doubt and curiosity. He found himself at the roulette table once again, his mind racing as the wheel spun. He placed his bets mechanically, almost without thinking, and then he lost. It was a small loss, hardly enough to dent his confidence, but it planted a seed of unease. For the first time, Alexei felt the sting of defeat, the realization that luck was as fleeting as it was intoxicating. The general, meanwhile, was unraveling. His debts had reached a critical point, and his desperation was becoming impossible to hide. Telegrams arrived daily with updates on Grandmama's health, each one a roller coaster of hope and despair. Blanche, ever the opportunist, continued to manipulate the general, coaxing him into further debts with promises of a bright future. Alexei watched the spectacle with a mixture of amusement and disdain. The general's plight seemed almost comical in its absurdity, yet it served as a stark reminder of the dangers of ambition. Polina remained an enigma, her motives and desires obscured by layers of secrecy. Alexei longed to understand her, to pierce the veil of mystery that surrounded her. But each time he tried, she deflected his questions with a smile or a sharp remark. One night, as they walked through the dimly lit streets of Roulettenberg, Alexei turned to her with a question that had been gnawing at him. "Why did you send me to Mr. Astley?" Polina looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because I needed to know if I could trust you." "And can you?" She smiled, a fleeting, enigmatic smile that left Alexei more confused than ever. "Perhaps," she said, "but trust is a dangerous thing, Alexei. It can break as easily as it's given." As Alexei lay awake that night, the weight of her words pressed down on him. Trust, luck, ambition, they were all part of the same game, a game he was only beginning to understand. The roulette wheel spun in his mind, a relentless cycle of hope and despair. And so, Alexei found himself at a crossroads, torn between his growing obsession with the roulette table and his deeper, more complicated feelings for Polina. The stakes were rising, and he knew that the choices he made would shape his fate in ways he could not yet foresee. Polina's reaction to Alexei's defeat was unexpected. Instead of anger or disappointment, she seemed almost amused. "So, you've tasted failure," she said with a wry smile. How does it feel? Alexei's pride bristled at her words. It's only money, he said dismissively. I'll win it back. Polina raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. And if you don't? I will, Alexei insisted. The wheel is fickle, but luck always comes around. Polina's smile faded, and for a moment her eyes softened. Be careful, Alexei, she said quietly. Luck is a dangerous thing to rely on. The following day, Alexei found himself summoned to the general's study. The older man was in a state of barely contained panic, pacing back and forth as he waved a telegram in the air. Grandmama is coming here, the general exclaimed, his voice trembling. Alexei blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. She's coming to Roulettenberg? Yes, the general said, sinking into a chair. She's decided to take matters into her own hands. She says she'll deal with the inheritance herself. The news sent shockwaves through the household. Grandmama was a force of nature, a woman whose presence was as commanding as her wealth. Her arrival in Roulettenberg promised to upend everything and everyone around her. Polina's reaction to the news was strangely subdued. She listened quietly as the general ranted and raved, her expression giving nothing away. Later, when Alexei confronted her about it, she simply shrugged. Grandmama is coming, she said. What happens next is anyone's guess. As the day of Grandmama's arrival drew closer, the tension in the general's household reached a fever pitch. Blanche, sensing the potential for disaster, began to distance herself from the general, her flirtations growing increasingly half-hearted. The general, for his part, vacillated between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that his aunt's presence would somehow solve all his problems. For Alexei, the impending arrival of Grandmama felt like the calm before a storm. The roulette table continued to beckon, its promises of fortune and ruin more enticing than ever. And in the midst of it all was Polina, her intentions as inscrutable as the spinning wheel itself. Grandmama arrived with the force of a thunderstorm, her carriage rumbling into Roulettenberg as if heralding an invasion. Antonida Vasilyevna was everything Alexei had imagined and more, a diminutive woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense and an indomitable spirit that belied her frail frame. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, her presence commanding attention and obedience in equal measure. The general, who had spent weeks fretting over her arrival, greeted her with a mixture of fawning obsequiousness and barely concealed terror. Grandmama, however, wasted no time on pleasantries. She swept into the household like a queen inspecting her domain, her sharp tongue and unfiltered opinions sparing no one. So this is how you live, she said, casting a critical eye over the general's opulent but debt-ridden home. And this Frenchwoman you've been throwing money at? Where is she? The general flushed crimson, mumbling excuses about Blanche being indisposed. Grandmama snorted in disdain. Indisposed? My foot! She's probably off spending your last ruble. Honestly, I don't know how you managed to make such a mess of things. Alexei, who had been watching the scene unfold with barely concealed amusement, found himself unexpectedly drawn into Grandmama's orbit. She turned her sharp gaze on him, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. And you, what's your story? She demanded. Alexei hesitated, unsure how to respond. I'm the tutor, he said finally. Ah, the tutor, Grandmama said, her tone skeptical. You look more like a gambler to me. The comment caught Alexei off guard. How had she guessed? Before he could respond, Grandmama waved him away, as if already bored by his presence. As the days passed, Grandmama's influence on the household became increasingly evident. She took control of the finances, demanding to see every bill and ledger. Her sharp eye and no-nonsense attitude left no room for deception, and the general's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under her scrutiny. But it was at the casino that Grandmama's true character revealed itself. To everyone's astonishment, the elderly matriarch announced her intention to visit the roulette tables. What better way to see how this town works, she said with a gleam in her eye. The general protested vehemently, horrified at the thought of his esteemed aunt engaging in such a vulgar pastime. But Grandmama was not one to be dissuaded. She dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand and marched into the casino with Alexei in tow. The sight of Grandmama at the roulette table was nothing short of extraordinary. Dressed in her austere black gown, she stood out starkly against the glittering opulence of the casino. Yet there was something about her presence that commanded respect. Even the croupier seemed taken aback as she placed her first bet with a firm, unflinching hand. Alexei watched in awe as Grandmama played with a combination of boldness and calculation. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of the game, her bets carefully chosen and executed with precision. At first she won modestly, her pile of chips growing steadily. "See that?" she said to Alexei, with a triumphant smile. "It's all about knowing when to stop. But of course, most fools don't." True to her word, Grandmama cashed out after her initial string of victories, much to the dismay of the crowd that had gathered to watch her play. Despite her success, Grandmama's venture into the casino set off a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences. News of her winnings spread quickly, and soon everyone in Roulettenberg was talking about the formidable Russian matriarch who had taken the roulette tables by storm. Blanche, ever the opportunist, saw an opportunity to ingratiate herself with Grandmama. She began to frequent the household, her charm turned up to its highest setting. But Grandmama was not so easily swayed. "You're a pretty little thing," she said to Blanche during one particularly awkward encounter, "but I see right through. You think you can fool me, but you're not half as clever as you think." Blanche's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, offering a sugary laugh that only seemed to irritate Grandmama further. Meanwhile, Alexei's relationship with Polina grew increasingly complex. Her moods were as unpredictable as the roulette wheel, swinging between moments of warmth and sharp, biting remarks. One evening, after another tense conversation about her mysterious dealings with Mr. Astley, Alexei finally confronted her. "Why do you keep me at arm's length?" he demanded. Polina looked at him, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Because you're a fool, Alexei. You think you can solve everything with passion and bravado, but the world doesn't work that way." "Then tell me how it works, Alexei," said his voice rising. "Tell me what you want, Polina." Polina's expression softened, but only for a moment. "What I want is freedom," she said quietly. "Freedom from this house, from the debts, from the general schemes. And if I have to use you to get it, I will." Her words cut Alexei to the core, but they also ignited a fire within him. He resolved to prove himself to her, to show her that he was more than just a pawn in her game. As Grandmama continued to shake up the household, Alexei found himself drawn deeper into the world of gambling. The roulette table became both his sanctuary and his tormentor, a place where he could momentarily forget his troubles even as he courted ruin. But the stakes were rising, and the arrival of Grandmama had set the stage for a dramatic reckoning. The roulette wheel spun on, its relentless motion mirroring the chaos of Alexei's life. And as the fortunes of everyone in the household hung in the balance, Alexei realized that his greatest gamble was yet to come. Grandmama's triumph at the roulette table was short-lived. Despite her initial resolve to play only for amusement, she returned the next evening, and this time her bets were bolder. The lure of easy winnings had taken hold, and her confidence grew with each spin of the wheel. At first, luck seemed to favor her again. The crowd around her cheered as she amassed a small fortune, and even Alexei found himself swept up in the excitement. But Grandmama's boldness soon turned to recklessness. She began to chase larger and larger winnings, doubling her bets with each loss, her hands trembling with a mix of determination and desperation. Alexei stood by, alarmed. "Grandmama, perhaps it's time to stop," he urged. She shot him a withering look. "Stop? Are you mad? The wheel owes me." But the wheel, as Alexei knew all too well, owed nothing to anyone. Grandmama's fortune dwindled before their eyes. her once commanding presence reduced to a frantic shadow of itself. By the end of the night, she had lost everything she had won, and more. The general was beside himself with rage when he learned of Grandmama's losses. "This is a disaster," he bellowed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Grandmama, however, remained defiant. "What I've done is none of your concern," she retorted. "If you'd managed your own. Affairs better? We wouldn't be in this mess to begin with." The general's face turned an alarming shade of red, but he held his tongue. He could not afford to alienate Grandmama entirely, not while her inheritance remained a tantalizing possibility. Polina, meanwhile, observed the chaos with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Your Grandmama has more spirit than the rest of us combined," she remarked to Alexei one evening. Alexei nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He had been spending more and more time at the roulette table, his losses mounting with each passing day. The thrill of the game had become an addiction, a way to escape the frustrations and humiliations of his life. One night after another, crushing defeat, Alexei found himself wandering the streets of Roulettenberg, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. He thought of Polina and her sharp words, of the general's spiraling desperation, and of Grandmama's defiant gamble. They were all trapped, he realized, caught in a web of their own making, each pursuing their desires with reckless abandon. The next morning, Alexei received an unexpected summons from Mr. Astley. The Englishman, who had always seemed more an observer than a participant in the household's drama, had taken an interest in Alexei's plight. "I've heard about your losses," Mr. Astley said bluntly, "and about your attachment to Polina." Alexei bristled at the implied criticism. "What of it?" Mr. Astley regarded him with a steady gaze. "You're a smart man, Alexei, smarter than most, I'd wager, but you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. The roulette table is no place for someone like you." Alexei laughed bitterly. "And where should I go then? Back to being the general's lackey? Back to watching Polina tear herself apart?" Mr. Astley's expression softened. "You have a choice," he said. "You can walk away from all this, start fresh. But if you stay here, if you keep chasing something that's out of reach, you'll destroy yourself." The words lingered in Alexei's mind as he returned to the casino that evening. The roulette table was as crowded as ever, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. He watched as the wheels spun, the clatter of the ball echoing in his ears like a drumbeat. For a moment he hesitated. He thought of Polina, of Grandmama, of the General and Blanche and all the others whose lives revolved around this place. He thought of Mr. Astley's warning and of the fleeting thrill of victory that had drawn him here in the first place. Then he placed his bet. The night was a blur of highs and lows, of victories snatched from the jaws of defeat and losses that left him reeling. By the time Alexei stumbled out of the casino, the first rays of dawn were breaking over Roulettenberg. His pockets were empty, his mind a whirlwind of regret and resolve. Polina was waiting for him when he returned to the general's house. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, and her expression unreadable. "You've been gambling again," she said, her voice flat. Alexei nodded, too exhausted to deny it. Polina sighed and stepped aside, letting him pass. "You're a fool," she said softly. Alexei paused, turning to look at her. "And you?" he asked. "What are you?" Polina didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, leaving Alexei alone in the dim light of the morning. The stakes had never been higher, and Alexei knew that the choices he made in the days to come would determine the course of his life. The roulette wheel had become a symbol of everything he both desired and despised, a reflection of his own restless, self-destructive spirit. But even as he grappled with his demons, he couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change? Or was he destined to spin out of control, like the roulette wheel itself? Polina's presence haunted Alexei like a specter, her words echoing in his mind as he wandered the streets of Roulettenberg. The casino loomed in the distance, its grand facade both a lure and a warning. He tried to resist its pull, but the thought of proving himself to Polina, to Grandmama, to the General, drew him back time and time again. That evening, Alexei sat outside the General's home, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set. Polina emerged, her face pale but composed, a stack of letters clutched in her hand. She paused when she saw him, her expression unreadable. "Are those for Astley?" Alexei asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Polina's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she held out one of the letters. "This is for you," she said simply. Alexei took the letter, his heart pounding. It was unsealed, and Polina gave him a small nod as if to say, "Go on, read it." The letter was brief, but heavy with meaning. It was from a creditor demanding immediate repayment of the General's debts. The amount was staggering, far beyond anything the General could hope to pay. Alexei looked up at Polina, his chest tightening. "This is why you've been meeting with Astley," he said, the realization dawning on him. Polina nodded. "And it's why I need you, Alexei." The word struck him like a blow. "You need me?" Polina stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "The General is finished. Blanche will bleed him dry, and when she's done, she'll leave him in ruin. But if we can pay off these debts, if we can secure even a small fortune, we can escape. Together." The "we" hung in the air between them, fragile but tantalizing. Alexei felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by suspicion. "And what about Astley?" he asked. Polina's expression darkened. "Astley is a backup plan. But he doesn't understand me, Alexei. Not like you do." The next day, Alexei accompanied Polina to the casino. She had drawn him into her scheme, convincing him that the roulette table was their best chance at salvation. The plan was simple: play conservatively, win enough to cover the debts, and leave before greed overtook them. But as they stood before the spinning wheel, Alexei felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the clatter of the ball, the hushed anticipation of the crowd. It was intoxicating. Polina placed her bets with a calm, calculating precision, while Alexei played with a reckless abandon that made her grip his arm in warning. "Focus," she hissed. "We can't afford to lose." But the allure of the game was too strong. Alexei's losses mounted, each one a blow to his pride and a step closer to disaster. Polina, meanwhile, managed to win just enough to keep them in the game. As the hours passed, their fortunes fluctuated wildly. Polina's calm facade began to crack, her hands trembling as she placed her bets. Alexei, too, felt the strain, his mind racing as he tried to outwit the wheel. Finally, Polina turned to him, her face pale but determined. "This is it, Alexei. One final bet." She placed the last of their money on a single number, her eyes fixed on the wheel as it began to spin. The room seemed to hold its breath, the clatter of the ball louder than ever. When the wheel stopped, Polina's number had won. The crowd erupted in applause, but Alexei felt no relief. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the desperation that had driven them to this point. Polina scooped up the winnings, her hands shaking. "We did it," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Part 6. Polina's gambit, Polina's presence haunted Alexei like a specter, her words echoing in his mind as he wandered the streets of Roulettenberg. The casino loomed in the distance, its grand facade both a lure and a warning. He tried to resist its pull, but the thought of proving himself to Polina, to Grandmama, to the General, drew him back time and time again. That evening, Alexei sat outside the General's home, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun set. Polina emerged, her face pale but composed, a stack of letters clutched in her hand. She paused when she saw him, her expression unreadable. "Are those for Astley?" Alexei asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Polina's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she held out one of the letters. "This is for you," she said simply. Alexei took the letter, his heart pounding. It was unsealed, and Polina gave him a small nod as if to say, "Go on, read it." The letter was brief, but heavy with meaning. It was from a creditor demanding immediate repayment of the general's debts. The amount was staggering, far beyond anything the general could hope to pay. Alexei looked up at Polina, his chest tightening. "This is why you've been meeting with Astley," he said, the realization dawning on him. Polina nodded. "And it's why I need you, Alexei." The words struck him like a blow. "You need me?" Polina stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "The general is finished. Blanche will bleed him dry, and when she's done she'll leave him in ruin. But if we can pay off these debts, if we can secure even a small fortune, we can escape. Together?" The "we" hung in the air between them, fragile but tantalizing. Alexei felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by suspicion. "And what about Astley?" he asked. Polina's expression darkened. "Astley is a backup plan. But he doesn't understand me, Alexei, not like you do." The next day, Alexei accompanied Polina to the casino. She had drawn him into her scheme, convincing him that the roulette table was their best chance at salvation. The plan was simple: play conservatively, win enough to cover the debts, and leave before greed overtook them. But as they stood before the spinning wheel, Alexei felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the clatter of the ball, the hushed anticipation of the crowd. It was intoxicating. Polina placed her bets with a calm, calculating precision, while Alexei played with a reckless abandon that made her grip his arm in warning. "Focus," she hissed. "We can't afford to lose." But the allure of the game was too strong. Alexei's losses mounted, each one a blow to his pride and a step closer to disaster. Polina, meanwhile, managed to win just enough to keep them in the game. As the hours passed, their fortunes fluctuated wildly. Polina's calm facade began to crack, her hands trembling as she placed her bets. Alexei, too, felt the strain, his mind racing as he tried to outwit the wheel. Finally, Polina turned to him, her face pale but determined. "This is it, Alexei. One final bet." She placed the last of their money on a single number, her eyes fixed on the wheel as it began to spin. The room seemed to hold its breath, the clatter of the ball louder than ever. When the wheel stopped, Polina's number had won. The crowd erupted in applause, but Alexei felt no relief. The victory felt hollow, tainted by the desperation that had driven them to this point. Polina scooped up the winnings, her hands shaking. "We did it," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction, but the victory was short-lived. As they left the casino, the weight of what they had done settled over them like a shroud. Polina clutched the money to her chest, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting someone to snatch it away. Alexei tried to console her, but she pushed him away. "Don't," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't pretend this fixes everything." The walk back to the general's house was silent, the tension between them palpable. When they arrived, Polina disappeared into her room without a word, leaving Alexei alone with his thoughts. That night, Alexei sat by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. The thrill of the casino had faded, replaced by a gnawing sense of emptiness. He thought of Polina's desperate gamble, of Grandmama's stubborn pride, and of his own spiraling descent into addiction. Was this what freedom looked like? A fleeting victory won at the cost of their dignity and peace of mind? As the first rays of dawn lit up the horizon, Alexei made a decision. He would confront Polina, demand the truth about her feelings and her plans. He needed to know if there was still a chance for them, or if they were doomed to remain prisoners of their own desires. Morning brought no solace to Alexei's restless mind. The house was eerily quiet, the usual commotion replaced by a strained stillness. Polina's door remained closed, and Alexei paced the hallway, debating whether to knock. Finally, he mustered the courage. His knock was firm but hesitant, a request more than a demand. "Polina," he called softly, "we need to talk." After a long pause, the door creaked open. Polina stood before him, her face drawn but resolute. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The room was sparsely furnished, its simplicity a stark contrast to Polina's enigmatic presence. She gestured for Alexei to sit, but he remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "I can't keep doing this," he began, his voice trembling. "The games, the schemes, the uncertainty. I need to know where we stand." Polina looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "And what do you want me to say, Alexei? That I love you? That I don't? What difference would it make?" Her words cut, deeper than he had expected. "It makes every difference," he said, his voice rising. "You've drawn me into your chaos, made me believe there was something worth fighting for." "If that was all a lie," Polina interrupted him, her voice sharp. "A lie? You think I wanted this? To be trapped in a house with Blanche, scheming for the general's money and you spinning out of control at the roulette table?" Alexei stepped closer, his anger fading into desperation. "Then why, Polina? Why involve me at all? Why not turn to Astley or anyone else?" For a moment Polina said nothing. Then she looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I trust you." The confession hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alexei's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't saying. Before he could press further, a knock at the door startled them both. Polina hurried to answer it, revealing one of the general's servants. "Madame Blanche requests your presence," the servant announced, his tone formal but insistent. Polina sighed, her expression hardening. "Tell her I'll be there shortly." As, the servant departed. Alexei felt his frustration boil over. "Blanche? Why do you let her control you? She has no power over you, Polina." Polina turned to him, her eyes flashing. "You don't understand, Alexei. Blanche isn't the problem. The general's debts are. If I don't keep her placated, she'll ruin what little chance we have left." Alexei watched as Polina left, the room, his mind racing. Blanche's influence over the household was undeniable, but it was Polina's calm acceptance of her role that troubled him most. He had seen her defiance, her sharp wit, her refusal to be cowed by anyone. Yet here she was, bending to Blanche's will for reasons he couldn't fully grasp. Determined to uncover the truth, Alexei decided to follow Polina. He kept his distance as she made her way to Blanche's room, slipping inside without hesitation. Through the slightly ajar door, Alexei caught snippets of their conversation. Blanche's voice was sickeningly sweet, her words dripping with feigned concern. "You've been quite the busy little bird, haven't you, Polina?" Blanche cooed. "But don't forget who holds the strings in this house." Polina's response was calm but firm. "I haven't forgotten. But don't underestimate me, Blanche. I'm not as helpless as you think." Blanche's laugh was cold and mocking. "Oh, I know exactly what you're capable of, my dear. That's why I'm keeping such a close eye on you." As the conversation continued, Alexei felt his anger rise. Blanche's manipulation was clear, but what troubled him more was Polina's willingness to engage with her. It was as if she had resigned herself to playing a game she didn't believe she could win. When Polina finally emerged, Alexei was waiting for her in the hallway. She froze when she saw him, her expression a mixture of surprise and guilt. "How long have you been standing there?" she demanded. "Long enough," Alexei replied. "What is she holding over you, Polina? What aren't you telling me?" Polina hesitated, her eyes darting to the door behind her. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "I can handle Blanche. You should focus on your own problems, Alexei." But Alexei wasn't willing to let it go. He stepped closer, his voice low but insistent. "This isn't just about you, Polina. Whatever you're hiding, it affects all of us. If you want me to trust you, then you need to trust me too." Polina looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're right," she said quietly. "There's more to this than you know, but I can't tell you everything. Not yet." Alexei's frustration was palpable, but he nodded. "Then let me help you," he said. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Polina gave him a small, sad smile. "You're too good for this place, Alexei. For me." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone, in the dimly lit hallway. As the day wore on, Alexei found himself drawn back to the roulette table. The spinning wheel had become a cruel metaphor for his life, each turn a reminder of the unpredictable forces that controlled his fate. But this time, he wasn't just gambling for himself, he was playing for Polina, for the chance to free her from Blanche's grasp and the suffocating confines of Roulettenberg. The stakes had never been higher, and Alexei knew that the risks he took now would determine the course of their future. The casino buzzed with life. The usual throng of gamblers hunched over tables, their faces etched with desperation and hope. Alexei stood at the roulette table, his mind a storm of determination and doubt. His remaining funds were meager, but they were all he had. He clutched the small wad of notes in his hand, knowing that every spin was a step closer to redemption or ruin. As the croupier called for bets, Alexei hesitated. The numbers on the roulette wheel blurred before his eyes, each one carrying the weight of possibility. He thought of Polina's face, the fear she tried to hide behind her defiance. "Everything on black," Alexei said suddenly, his voice steadier. Then he felt. The other players turned to look at him, their gazes filled with curiosity and disbelief. It was a bold bet, one that could either elevate him or destroy him in an instant. The ball spun, its clatter filling the silence as every eye followed its chaotic path. Alexei gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. When the ball finally settled, it landed squarely on black. A wave of exhilaration coursed through him as the croupier pushed the winnings toward him. It was a modest amount compared to the fortunes some had won and lost that evening, but to Alexei it was a lifeline. He didn't stop there. Spurred by his small victory, he placed another bet and then another, each one calculated and precise. The crowd around him grew, their murmurs of admiration and envy feeding his confidence. But as his pile of chips grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. With every win, the stakes felt higher, the risk of losing it all more suffocating. He knew. He had to stop before the wheel turned against him, but the lure of the game was intoxicating. Hours passed in a blur of spinning wheels and shifting fortunes. By the time Alexei finally stepped away from the table, his winnings were substantial, a sum that could cover the general's debts and give Polina a chance at freedom. As he walked through the casino's grand halls, the weight of the money in his pockets felt surreal. For the first time in weeks, Alexei allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Returning to the house, Alexei found Polina in the drawing room, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the fireplace. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of relief and wariness. "You've been at the casino," she said, her tone accusatory. Alexei nodded, pulling a stack of notes from his pocket and placing them on the table. "This is for you," he said simply. Polina stared at the money, her eyes widening. "You won all this?" "It's enough to pay off the debts," Alexei said, his voice firm. "You don't need Blanche, Polina. You don't need Astley. We can leave, start over somewhere new." For a moment, Polina looked as though she might agree. But then her expression darkened, and she shook her head. "You don't understand, Alexei. It's not that simple. Blanche isn't the only one we have to worry about." "Then explain it to me," Alexei demanded, his frustration boiling over. "I've risked everything for you, Polina. The least you can do is tell me the truth." Polina hesitated, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "The general's debts go deeper than you know," she said finally. "There are people, powerful people, who won't just let us walk away." Alexei felt his stomach sink. "And you were going to face them alone?" Polina met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I've been facing them alone my entire life, Alexei. But now," her voice softened, "now I have you." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. The general stumbled into the room, his face flushed and his eyes wild. Behind him trailed Blanche, her expression smug and triumphant. "Paulina," the general cried, his voice slurring, "you won't believe it. Blanche and I are to be married." Paulina's face hardened, her composure unraveling. "Married?" she repeated, her voice icy. "And how exactly do you plan to afford such a luxury?" Blanche stepped forward, her smile sharp. "The general has assured me that his fortunes are secure. Isn't that right, darling?" The general nodded vigorously, his movements unsteady. "Yes, yes, everything will be fine." Alexei felt a surge of anger as he watched the scene unfold. He stepped between Paulina and Blanche, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're deluding yourself, General. Blanche doesn't care about you or your fortune. She's using you." The general turned on Alexei, his face red with indignation. "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm still your superior." "Not anymore," Alexei said coldly. He placed the money on the table between them. "This is enough to cover your debts. Use it wisely or lose everything." Blanche's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she calculated her next move. Paulina, meanwhile, looked at Alexei with something akin to gratitude, though her expression remained guarded. "Come on, Paulina," Alexei said, holding out his hand. "Let's leave this madness behind." Paulina hesitated, her gaze shifting between Alexei and the general. Finally she took his hand, her grip firm. As they left the room, Alexei felt a sense of triumph tempered by the knowledge that their journey was far from over. The money was only a temporary reprieve. The true challenge lay ahead. They continued their journey, keeping to the quieter streets and avoiding well-lit areas. Alexei's mind raced with plans and possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. He knew they couldn't stay in Roulettenberg much longer. Blanche's reach extended far beyond the confines of the general's household. As dawn began to break, they found themselves on the outskirts of the city. The air was colder here, the horizon painted with the soft hues of morning. Paulina shivered, and Alexei shrugged off his coat, draping it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Alexei managed a small smile. "We're going to make it, Paulina, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. Their enemies were numerous and resourceful, and the odds seemed stacked against them. Yet Alexei clung to the hope that somehow they could find a way to leave the shadows of their past behind. As they continued down the dusty road, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, Alexei felt a flicker of determination reignite within him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect Paulina and give them both a chance at a new beginning. The journey away from Roulettenberg was long, and the road grew increasingly desolate as they ventured further from the city. Alexei and Paulina traveled by foot, avoiding towns and villages where their faces might be recognized. They only stopped, when absolutely necessary, their meager belongings stashed in a small satchel. With each passing day, the weight of their situation became clearer. The money they had won at the casino had bought them temporary relief, but it wasn't enough to secure a permanent escape. Paulina's fear of Blanche and the general's debts still loomed over them, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. One evening, as they sat by a campfire under the starlit sky, Paulina spoke in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Alexei, I've been thinking—" Alexei looked up from the fire, his eyes locking with hers. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, then continued, "You promised me a new life, a chance at freedom, but I don't know if I can live like this, always running, always looking over my shoulder." Alexei's heart clenched at her words. He had promised her a future, but as time passed, he began to wonder if the life they sought was just an illusion. Could they ever truly escape the web of deceit and manipulation they had found themselves entangled in? "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "One step at a time. You're not alone, Paulina. I'll keep you safe. We'll make a new start. I don't care where it is, just as long as it's with you." Paulina didn't respond immediately, instead staring into the fire as the flames flickered in her eyes. She had known for a long time that her life had been ruled by others, by Blanche, by the general, by fate itself. The idea of being free, of taking control of her own destiny, was both thrilling and terrifying. But in Alexei, she saw a possibility, not just of escape, but of something more. A life where she wasn't defined by her past, where she could be more than the sum of her mistakes. "I don't know if I can believe in that," she admitted softly. "I don't know if I can believe in anything anymore." Alexei's voice was firm yet tender. "Then let me believe for both of us." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, the quiet rustling of the trees around them. The next few days were filled with uncertainty, but Alexei's determination never wavered. He found work wherever he could, odd jobs, laboring for small inns or farmers who needed help. Each coin earned was a step closer to the freedom they both craved. Yet, with each passing day, the reality of their situation settled deeper into his bones. The money they had was quickly running out, and the general's agents would eventually catch up to them. As they crossed into a new town, Alexei spotted a familiar face, a man he had seen briefly in Roulettenberg, a low-level gambler who had once been in the same circle as Alexei. The man's eyes widened in recognition as Alexei passed, but Alexei made no move to acknowledge him. They couldn't. Afford attention, not now. It wasn't long before their quiet existence was interrupted again. The man had followed them. Alexei and Polina were in a small inn on the edge of town when he approached them in the dimly lit hallway. "You're not as clever as you think," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Blanche wants her money back, and she doesn't forget." A debt. Alexei's heart sank. He knew the time had come, the time when their past would finally catch up with them. "What do you want?" Alexei asked, his tone controlled, but his pulse quickening. The man's eyes gleamed with greed. "Blanche is offering a handsome reward for anyone who brings you back. I'm afraid that means your little escape ends here." Before Alexei could react, the man lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm. Polina screamed, but Alexei was faster. With a swift motion, he knocked the man off balance and shoved him against the wall. "Stay away from us," Alexei hissed. The man staggered back, his expression a mixture of surprise and anger. "You think you can outrun her forever?" he spat. "You'll never be free?" Alexei stared at the man, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "We will be free. We just have to keep fighting." The encounter left them shaken, but it didn't break them. That night, Alexei and Polina decided it was time to leave the town. They couldn't stay here any longer, not with Blanche's agents on their trail. As they packed their belongings, Polina turned to Alexei, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Alexei paused, then smiled faintly. "Anywhere but here. We'll keep moving forward. We'll find a way to outrun this." Polina nodded, a sense of determination creeping into her voice. "I'll go wherever you lead me, Alexei, as long as we're together." And so, with no clear destination and no assurances of success, they set out once more. The road ahead was uncertain, but Alexei knew that they couldn't stay in the shadows forever. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with Polina by his side. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope that they could build a life free from the chains of their past. But as they disappeared into the night, the distant echo of roulette wheels spinning, the shadow of Blanche's wrath loomed ever closer. The game was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher.